Hey, guys! New Orleans is a creepy place. It's gothic in one sense and dangerous in another. The city has a rich and colorful history and is the perfect place to seek out the supernatural. New Orleans boasts a whole host of vampire, graveyard, voodoo and ghost tours that often last up to 2 hours. It is known as one of the most haunted cities in America. I went on a vampire tour in the French Quarter, so I'll share the details with you. Why? Because being scared is better when you can share the experience, release imagined fear from your mind, and clear your imagination of the terror terrorizing the imagination of others. But before we begin, subscribe to our channel, give it a like and post the video on social media. Then join me on a journey to uncover the legendary lore of New Orleans' most famous vampires. After all, vampire legends are an important part of New Orleans' history. 1. The Count of Saint-Germain and Jacques Saint-Germain. Let's start with the Count of Saint-Germain. Vampire stories go back to France in the illustrious 1700s, when a mysterious man appeared and enchanted the courts of Europe. The Comte de Saint-Germain was a very strange, unusual and mysterious character. He was a master of the piano and violin, could speak 6 different languages, and his conversational skills were second to none, a skill that is now a lost art. He also composed music, including arias and solo works for violin. His wealth was unfathomable. He wore jewelry in his clothes, and no one knew how he came into such wealth. No one knew anything about his family, where he came from, or who he was. According to some reports, he claimed to be the son of Francis II Ricosa, a prince of Transylvania. One of his greatest passions was alchemy, and he is believed to have had an extraordinary talent for maintaining his youth. Perhaps it was his extensive knowledge of cosmetics and herbs that kept him young. The philosopher Voltaire called him a man who knows everything and never dies. No one knew his true age. He looked about 40 in all his portraits and continued to appear that way for more than half a century. Although he was charming, endearing, and graced the dinner tables of many dukes and kings, no one ever saw him eat anything. He only sipped wine gracefully and talked about everything from history to chemistry. There has been much speculation about the Earl's origins and vast wealth, which has led to the development of many myths and legends about his origins. Some believe he possessed immortality, as many claim to have seen him after his death in 1784. Next, let's move to New Orleans, Louisiana, and a man named Jacques Saint-Germain appears in the early 20th century. He fits every description of the Count above. He's in his early 40s with heavy money bags, the most charming dinner guests and still a complete mystery. He threw lavish parties and invited the elite, and everyone sat in raptures of conversation and food. But strangely enough, this Jacques would never eat a bite, only a sip of his wine. One night, a few months after moving to New Orleans, his lady stayed a little later. On his balcony, at the corner of Ursuline and Royal Streets, this Saint-Germain grabbed her and tried to bite her neck. She escaped by falling off the balcony and then reported the incident to the police. When the police came to investigate, Jacques Saint-Germain had disappeared. They searched his apartment and found tablecloths with large bloodstains on them. They searched the kitchen, where they found no signs of food or evidence that food had ever been there. All they found were bottles of wine, and after pouring themselves a glass, drinking it, and then spitting it out, they discovered that it wasn't just wine in those bottles, it was wine mixed with human blood. It is unclear whether the Count of Saint-Germain and Jacques are the same person, but believers speculate that they are. To this day, the mysterious figure of Count Saint-Germain has his own occult followers, from theosophists to complete exit mystics. Although he supposedly died in 1784, no one saw him die, and some claim to have seen him many years later. Nevertheless, he disappeared from court life. I would have, too, had I known that the French Revolution was coming, which some claim he foresaw. 2. John and Wayne Carter. New Orleans has one of the highest murder rates in the world. It has always been a notorious place for missing people, meaning it's a place where people just disappear and no one ever knows what happened to them. French, Spanish, Indian, African, Creole, and English blood mix here, where the mosquito is not so picky. Perhaps there are no other creatures. John and Wayne Carter were brothers. They seemed normal in every way. They had normal working jobs on the riverbank and lived in the French Quarter. It was the 1930s during the Great Depression and times were hard, so man worked the best he could. One day, the girl reportedly escaped from the Carter brothers' apartment and ran to the authorities. Her wrists were slashed, not enough to cause immediate death, but enough to make her blood drain slowly over the next few days. Police officers ran to Carter's third apartment and found 4 other people tied to chairs with their wrists sliced in the same way. Some had been there for many days. The story was that the brothers had kidnapped these men to drink their blood at the end of each day when they came home from work. The police also found about 14 dead bodies. The police waited for the brothers to return, and when they did, they needed 7 or 8 men to restrain the 2 medium-sized men. Several years later, when the Carters were finally executed, their bodies were placed in a New Orleans vault. The cemeteries in New Orleans are quite picturesque. Not only are they more decorated than the rest of the nation, but they bring together many generations of the same family in one vault. The remains are sifted through the bottom of the vault, and when it's all rubble, a new body slides inside. Many years after the Carter brothers died, when they placed another Carter in the family vault, they found that the vault was completely empty, no John or Wayne. They left. To this day, many sightings have occurred in the French Quarter that almost exactly match the descriptions of the 2 brothers. Years later, the owner of their apartment saw 2 figures on the balcony that matched their descriptions on the street, whispering to each other. Both figures jumped from the top of the 3rd floor of the balcony and rushed off. Legend has it that if a vampire drinks your blood 7 nights in a row, then and only then can you become a vampire. Some of those found in the Carter brothers' apartment had been there for more than 7 days. One pervert named Felipe became a notorious serial killer. And, of course, he would do more than just kill his victims. He was believed to drink the blood of all 32 of his victims. 3. The New Orleans Girl Box. During the colonization of New Orleans by France, it was difficult to convince women to make the journey. This was mainly due to the fact that the men originally sent were thieves, murderers, and criminals of all types and kinds, not to mention the snakes, alligators, mosquitoes, and humidity of Louisiana. Eventually, some women were dispatched. Some sources say they were nuns while others say they were prostitutes, but still, some of them made it. Many of them jumped off the ship in Mobile, Alabama when they ported there and were told they would be married if they stayed aboard. Historically, these women were called casket girls, in reference to the small chests in which they carried their clothes and other things. However, legend has it that these girls had the most interesting luggage in the form of small coffins. Thus, to the horror of the people of New Orleans, everything that arrived in New Orleans was 300 of these coffin-like suitcases. Some stories say they were empty, some say they contained the undead. These suitcases were reportedly stored in the attic of a convent in the French Quarter, where they still sit behind closed nailed windows because they have a strange habit of just opening on their own. Years later, in 1978, 2 amateur reporters demanded that the priest of the monastery allow them to see these coffins. The priest, of course, denied them entry, so one night the 2 men climbed over the wall with their recording equipment and set up their workstation. The next morning, the journalists' equipment was scattered on this street, and the nearly decapitated bodies of these 2 men were found on the front steps of the monastery. 80% of their blood was missing. To this day, this unsolved crime has stumped investigators. However, research shows that these legends are completely unsupported by historical data. It is unclear how and when the myth of the Tomb Girls began, but the story continues to haunt tourists and believers to this day. These are the stories I was told and the reason I had trouble sleeping. We were also shown certain settings of the movie Interview with a Vampire, based on Anne Rice's vampire books set in New Orleans. Are vampires real? Clinical vampirism has been recognized as a neurological condition in which symptomatic patients drink human blood in the belief that it is good for their health. Psychologists say that the symptoms begin with incidents in childhood that link a sexual connection to blood consumption. This interest in blood leads the person to drink their own blood and eventually the blood of other people or animals. John Edgar Browning, Ph.D., candidate at Louisiana State University, conducted research in New Orleans that determined that there were about 50 people identified as vampires living in New Orleans alone. Many of the real vampires of New Orleans have fangs or have a nocturnal lifestyle. Studies have shown that these markers are cultural, but vampires insist they are biological. Another study by the Atlanta Vampire Alliance reported about 5,000 such people in the United States. However, clinical vampirism, sometimes called Renfield syndrome, has not been recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Those who identify as vampires even have their own organization in New Orleans known as the New Orleans Vampire Association, or NOVA. The organization accepts all paradigms or varieties of those who identify as vampires. So too is the New Orleans Vampire Association, NOVA, and it is governed by a board that consists of members of 7 houses that serve as denominational sects reflecting different aspects of NOVA's social values. Browning's research included a large amount of time spent at NOVA meetings, from which he observed that the members were predominantly Caucasian. There were about the same number of males and females, and members ranged in age from 18 to 50. The association was founded in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. Members participate in charitable events such as distributing food to the homeless and holding silent auctions. However, their website is currently unmaintained and it is unclear if they are still active. Guys, if you liked our video but haven't subscribed to us yet, then subscribe now and post the video on social media. There will be more to come in the next episodes. See you soon. Bye.